Have you ever been reading through the Bible, um, moving along at a steady pace, and suddenly you hit a genealogy?
Oh, yeah. The long list of hard-to-pronounce names.
Right. And if you were like most people, you probably just skipped right over it. I mean, it is so easy to assume that those lists are just dry, dusty history.
Just an irrelevant ancient record, with nothing to do with daily life today.
Yeah, but imagine reading a historical record where a simple conjunction, the tiny word "and," completely destroys the theology of an entire global empire. Welcome to Reformed thinking.
It is great to be here for this discussion.
Today, we are looking at a seemingly quiet list of names in the opening verses of Exodus, specifically Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 7.
And those verses pack a serious theological punch.
They really do. We're going to see how this specific text dismantles modern anxiety and proves God's absolute sovereignty over history.
We have two really dense theological treatises on the table today, both dissecting these 7 short verses.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is to extract the theological gold from these texts. We want to show you how God's sovereign multiplication of his people in ancient Egypt holds massive weight for trusting his providence right now, in your own life.
It is a remarkable text to study. When we approach these verses, we really have to recognize that we are not looking at a simple historical footnote.
Right, okay, let's unpack this. The energy in these sources is incredible, even though we are dealing with what looks like just a family roster.
Well, we are looking at the execution of divine decrees. The sources we are working from treat this text with a really high level of theological precision.
I noticed that. They do not treat it lightly at all.
No, they argue that history is the theater where God works out his preordained purposes. So what appears to be a simple demographic record is actually a theological thesis.
A thesis about how the creator of the universe upholds, directs, disposes, and governs all creatures and actions.
Spot on. The text shows us a God who is working in the quiet, the hidden spaces of family life and generational transition.
Preparing a massive redemptive movement long before the fire and the plagues even arrive on the scene.
Yes, we are looking at the invisible machinery of providence.
I love that phrase, the invisible machinery of providence. But to really see that machinery at work, we need to set the historical scene.
Because the contrast between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus is really jarring.
Oh, totally. If you read straight through from the end of Genesis into the beginning of Exodus, you get theological whiplash.
You really do.
I mean, the book of Genesis ended with Jacob's family living very comfortably in the fertile pastures of Goshen.
Right, they were protected by Joseph, who is functioning as the prime minister of Egypt.
They have the favor of the throne. They are essentially ancient VIPs. But Exodus opens in a totally different geopolitical climate.
A very hostile climate.
So what happened? I mean, what happened between the end of Genesis and the opening of Exodus?
Well, that gap in time represents a massive transition in Egyptian history, and our sources detail this extensively.
Let's walk through that history.
Sure, so when the Israelites originally entered Egypt during the time of Joseph, it was during what historians call the Second Intermediate Period.
Okay.
During this era, Egypt was ruled by the Hyksos, and the Hyksos were an Asiatic dynasty.
Meaning they were not native Egyptians.
Right. They were Semitic people, which meant they were ethnically and culturally friendly to other West Semitic people like Jacob and his family.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. The Hyksos had migrated into the Nile Delta region, bringing with them advanced bronze weapons and chariot technology, and they eventually established their own rule over Lower Egypt.
So this historical reality explains why Joseph was able to rise to such a high level of political authority so rapidly.
Yes, and why his family was granted the best land in Goshen. The ruling class looked favorably upon them because they shared a similar cultural background.
But that did not last forever.
No, it did not. By the time we reach the events described in Exodus 1, the political landscape has shifted violently. The Hyksos have been expelled.
Expelled by who?
Native Egyptian rulers from Upper Egypt, specifically the 18th dynasty under a leader named Ahmose I.
Wow. So they fought to get their country back.
They fought a brutal war of national liberation. They took their country back, and this new regime is entirely different from the one that welcomed Joseph.
I want to make this relatable for the listener because reading ancient history can sometimes feel a bit abstract.
It can, yeah.
It is kind of like a massive corporate buyout. Imagine you were the favorite employee of the old CEO. You were given the corner office, the best benefits, complete job security.
Because the CEO knew you and trusted your family.
Right. But overnight, a hostile rival firm takes over the company.
And the new board of directors does not care about your past achievements at all.
They do not care that you helped save the company from bankruptcy years ago.
Mm.
They look at your department, see how fast you are growing, and they just see a massive drain on resources.
A threat to their new vision for the company.
Yes. You went from being the favored VIP to being a target. And that is what happened to the Israelites.
To a severe degree.
Because Goshen, which is the ancient region of Honduras, was located in the eastern Nile Delta.
Under the new regime, that area became a critical military buffer zone.
The new Egyptian rulers looked at the massive presence of these Israelites not as friendly guests, but as a literal national security threat.
You have a new xenophobic, hyper-nationalistic regime that views this foreign population as a ticking time bomb right on their border.
That geopolitical shift is crucial for understanding the tension of the narrative.
Absolutely. The native Egyptians under Ahmose I had just spent decades fighting to push foreign rulers out of their land.
So the last thing they wanted was another Asiatic population living in their most strategic border region, multiplying rapidly.
Right, and our sources draw very specific parallels between this ancient Egyptian totalitarianism and modern cultural hostility.
Now, just to be clear for you listening, we are imparting this information strictly as an objective review of our source material.
Yes, we are impartially reporting how the authors apply this text to secular totalitarianism and cultural decay.
We are just examining how the authors see God's providence acting against hostile earthly empires, regardless of the era.
And the authors argue that the human heart inherently dreads historical erasure. So when a favorable regime suddenly turns hostile, the immediate human temptation is panic.
Because the Israelites were facing a state structure that demanded absolute allegiance.
Right. The pharaoh was worshipped as the living incarnation of a deity.
So the clash here is not just political, it is intensely religious.
The state viewed itself as supreme, and any group that multiplied rapidly and maintained a distinct identity was a threat to that supremacy.
I want you to really think about that. To imagine living through a massive political regime change, where your very existence suddenly becomes a threat to the state.
Your family's safety, your children's future, everything is plunged into uncertainty.
You go from being celebrated and protected to being viewed as the enemy. The psychological toll of that transition must have been overwhelming.
It would be terrifying.
That is the climate we are walking into in Exodus 1, and yet, how does the book actually begin?
It does not begin with a dramatic description of Egyptian oppression.
No, it begins with grammar. Let's talk about the grammar of grace.
That is a great way to put it.
The sources point out a fascinating detail right in the very first verse. The book of Exodus begins with the Hebrew conjunction wa.
In English, it is translated as, "and these are the names."
Why is that tiny word "and" getting so much attention in these theological treatises? I mean, it is just a conjunction.
Well, it gets attention because it links the history of redemption perfectly together.
How so?
The use of the wa copulative, that simple "and," tells the reader that Exodus is not a disconnected story of liberation.
It is the direct, unbroken continuation of the Genesis narrative.
Yes. The God who spoke the universe into existence, who judged the earth with a flood, who called Abraham, and who providentially guided Joseph,
Is the exact same God who is now managing the affairs of Israel in Egypt.
There is no parenthesis in God's plan. He did not hit a dead end when the Hyksos were overthrown. The divine purpose continues.
So this grammatical link insists that God governs history according to a single, continuous, eternal decree.
Spot on. In ancient Near Eastern literature, you often find mythological stories that are disjointed, where different gods take over and the narrative abruptly shifts direction.
Like competing deities fighting for control.
Right. But the Hebrew scriptures present a unified, sovereign architecture. That single conjunction proves that the promises made to Abraham in Genesis 15 are still actively in motion.
Okay, I see the value of the connection, but let me push back a little here, playing the skeptic for a second.
Go ahead.
Why list the 11 sons of Jacob again? We literally just read their names at the end of Genesis.
It is a fair question.
Ancient writing materials were expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Scribes did not just waste parchment. Why spend the ink to write out Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and all the rest right here at the start of a new scroll?
Why not just say, "and the children of Israel were in Egypt," and move on to the action?
Yeah, why repeat it?
That is a highly perceptive question, and the sources answer it by pointing to the concept of corporate solidarity and divine election.
Break that down for us.
Well, God does not deal with his people as a generic, faceless biological mass. He knows his elect by name.
By deliberately recording the names of the individuals who came down to Egypt, the text proves that God's grace is personal and particular.
Yes. The sources also highlight that the text organizes these men deliberately by their maternal lineages, the sons of Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah.
Which highlights the corporate solidarity and legal identity of the 12 tribes.
Precisely.
Wait, define that for the listener. What does corporate solidarity actually look like in practice? Because that sounds like a phrase you would hear in a law school, not a Bible study.
It is a legal concept,
Wow.
and it is crucial for understanding Reformed theology. Think of it like a class action lawsuit or a corporate entity where one person acts as the legal head for thousands of others. When the CEO signs a contract, the entire company is bound by it.
So in the biblical worldview, individuals are not isolated islands.
No, they belong to a covenantal structure. These names listed in Exodus 1, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, are the legal covenantal heads of their respective families.
When God looks at the nation of Israel, he sees them through the framework of these specific chosen men.
Yes. Furthermore, the sources recall that these men were not morally flawless heroes.
Not even close. I mean, Reuben defiled his father's bed,
Simeon and Levi committed a brutal massacre in Shechem.
and Judah sold his own brother into slavery. They had deeply troubled histories marked by sin and failure,
Yet their names are recorded here as the heirs of the promise.
which demonstrates that the covenant continues not because Jacob's sons were naturally noble or inherently worthy, but entirely because God is faithful to his own word.
It is a stunning display of grace.
That is a massive point. It brings the focus entirely off human performance and places it squarely on divine grace.
We love to build our heroes up and pretend they were perfect.
But the biblical text refuses to do that. It shows us their flaws and then lists their names anyway, proving that God's plans rely on his own character, not ours.
And then we hit verse 5.
Right, verse 5. The text gives us the total number of people who came out of the loin of Jacob, and it is precisely 70 souls.
The sources note that the Hebrew uses the collective singular noun nephesh, meaning soul, which shows their internal unity.
But 70 people. I hear what the sources are saying about God honoring weak beginnings, but frankly, 70 people is not just weak. It is a rounding error to the Egyptian empire.
It is a tiny group.
Egypt had massive cities, standing armies, monumental architecture. How does the text justify this tiny number as a deliberate strategy rather than just, historical happenstance?
It justifies it by contrasting human weakness with divine sovereignty.
Explain that.
The theological principle at play here is the deliberate weakness of covenant beginnings. The authors of our sources connect this directly to the New Testament.
They cite 1 Corinthians chapter 1.
Right. Yes, where the Apostle Paul writes that God chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong, and the foolish things to shame the wise.
So Israel did not begin its national life as an overwhelming military machine or a massive demographic powerhouse.
They began as a fragile, vulnerable family of 70 individuals walking into a foreign superpower.
When you measure 70 nomadic shepherds against the bureaucracy, the military might, and the architectural dominance of the Egyptian empire, the math seems laughable.
But God does not require impressive beginnings to accomplish his decrees. The stark contrast between their initial smallness and the later filling of the land is designed to magnify the absolute sovereignty of the Lord.
He purposefully starts with a number so small that when the massive multiplication happens, no one can attribute it to natural human sociology.
It has to be God.
That brings us to what might be the starkest, coldest transition in the passage. In verse 6, the narrative hits a wall.
It really does.
It says, "Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation." It is just so abrupt.
There is no sentimental lingering over their deathbeds.
There are no eulogies recorded here. The text just drops this heavy reality on us.
The human protectors are gone.
The men who knew the political landscape, the men who had the connections, the men who built the original wealth, they're all dead.
The systematic theology drawn from this single verse is incredibly heavy.
Let's talk about that.
Well, Joseph was not just a family member, he was their political protector. He was, as the sources phrase it, their human shield.
Through his wisdom and his position as prime minister, he mediated safety for his people.
But when he died and when his brothers died, the Israelites lost all human mediation of the covenant.
The historical finality of that moment is terrifying from a human perspective.
The text forces the reader to confront human mortality head-on. The physical pillars of the 12 tribes were laid in the dust.
And the sources argue that this abrupt statement forces us to deal with the concept of functional deism. I need to ask you about that, because that is another heavy theological term.
Yeah.
What does functional deism actually look like in practice for someone sitting in a pew today?
Sure, deism is the belief that God created the world, but then stepped back and let it run on its own without interfering.
Okay.
Functional deism is when a person claims to believe in an active, involved God, but they actually live their daily life relying entirely on visible human structures.
So they act as if God is distant, and their real security comes from their bank account, their political party, or their social connections.
Spot on. For the Israelites, functional deism would mean believing in Yahweh, but acting as if their survival actually depended entirely on Joseph staying alive and maintaining his political influence.
By stating so bluntly that Joseph died and all that generation died, the text shows us God's unmediated action. It cures creature worship.
It makes us look to God alone.
It makes me think of what happens when a church loses its most famous pastor, or when a massive global movement loses its charismatic founder.
People panic.
The world looks at that and assumes the movement will die with the leader. The momentum is gone. The shield is removed. The visionary is dead. So the assumption is that the project is over.
We see this in business all the time.
Oh, absolutely. A genius founder steps down and the company's stock tanks because the market believes the magic left with the founder. We tie the success of the work to the longevity of gifted individuals.
Precisely, and that is a universal human tendency. We struggle to separate the instrument from the primary cause.
But the sources argue that the death of the patriarchs was a necessary theological lesson.
If Joseph had lived forever, the Israelites might have trusted in Joseph's political acumen rather than Yahweh's eternal promise.
God buries his workers, but he continues his work.
The promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob relied entirely on the living God, not on the survival of great men.
The narrative refuses to hide mortality because it wants to prove that human mortality cannot annul a divine oath.
The survival of the church, or the people of God, does not depend on the survival of its best leaders.
I want you to pause and think about your own life right now. What human shields are you relying on?
That is a piercing question.
Maybe it is a specific political leader you think will protect your values. Maybe it is an influential mentor at your job or a financial safety net you have built up. What happens when those shields are removed?
What happens when the person you thought was standing between you and disaster is suddenly gone?
This text is challenging us to recognize that our ultimate security cannot rest on temporary human foundations.
Because once that generation dies, we see something supernatural happen.
The human shields are removed, the hostile regime takes over, and right in the middle of that terrifying vulnerability, we reach the climax of the passage in verse 7.
It's a demographic explosion.
The text says the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them.
There is this rapid sequential chain of 5 distinct Hebrew verbs used to describe their growth.
Let's look at those verbs, because this is not just a casual observation by their author. This is highly technical language.
The Hebrew grammar here is explosive. The 5 verbs are paru, meaning they were fruitful,
Okay.
then vayishretsu, meaning they swarmed, vayirbu, meaning they multiplied, vayatzmu, meaning they grew mighty.
And vatimale, meaning the land was filled.
This sequence moves from simple reproduction to massive physical strength and absolute geographical saturation.
Moses piles up these verbs to communicate a growth rate that defies any natural sociological explanation.
Let's unpack the first one, paru.
Yeah, tell me about that.
This word points directly back to the original creation mandate in Genesis 1, where God tells humanity to be fruitful.
It shows that the fundamental design of creation is working specifically for the Israelites.
Yes, and the sources point out something fascinating about that second verb, vayishretsu, to swarm.
I want to linger on this because this is a massive aha moment for me. They note that this word is extremely rare when talking about human populations.
It is almost never used for people.
Usually when you read that word in the Old Testament, like back in Genesis 1, it is used for aquatic life or creeping things. Bugs swarm, fish swarm, reptiles swarm. Humans do not typically swarm.
Why use that specific strange word here?
Right.
It is a striking detail, and it completely alters how you read the passage once you understand the cultural context.
Lay out that context for us.
The use of vayishretsu functions as a direct theological polemic against the gods of Egypt.
Okay, a polemic.
The Egyptians worshipped a vast pantheon of nature deities, and the Nile Delta's fertility was specifically associated with a frog goddess named Heket.
Heket.
Yes, she was the goddess of fertility, childbirth, and the annual flooding of the Nile, which brought life to the land. She was typically depicted as a woman with the head of a frog.
So, by using a verb associated with the teeming, swarming multiplication of river creatures, Moses is deliberately mocking the Egyptian religious system.
He is demonstrating that Yahweh completely hijacked the demographic capabilities of Egypt.
That is just incredible irony. I am imagining the sheer panic of the Egyptian officials.
It would have been maddening for them.
They worship a fraud goddess of fertility, expecting her to bless their own native population. But instead, the foreign slaves living in the military buffer zone are the ones swarming like river creatures.
God is essentially using Egypt's own land, their own resources, and the very concept of their own fertility goddess against them.
The Egyptian gods were entirely impotent to stop or control the birth rate of the Hebrews.
Yahweh was asserting absolute dominion over life and fertility right in the heart of Hecate's territory.
The psychological warfare here is brilliant.
It is a total theological humiliation of the Egyptian pantheon, occurring decades before the plagues even begin.
Right, the plagues will eventually target these gods explicitly.
But here in Exodus 1, God is already defeating them quietly in the maternity wards of Goshen.
And the text adds a superlative modifier to ensure we do not miss the supernatural element.
It says they grew mighty by marad, which translates to exceedingly, exceedingly.
The repetition of the word mied is an amplifier. This leaves zero room for naturalistic explanations.
Right, you cannot look at this and say, well, they just had really good diets in the fertile pastures of Goshen.
Or they had a naturally high birth rate because of their agrarian lifestyle. Agrarian societies grow, yes, but they do not swarm to the point of threatening a massive, established military empire.
The modern statistical impossibility of 70 people becoming a nation of over 1 million in a few centuries without modern medicine is staggering.
This is an act of direct, supernatural divine energy. The text is demanding that we see God's active hand causing this multiplication.
That is the necessary conclusion drawn by the theologians. The sources connect this explosive multiplication back to the grand narrative of Scripture.
Remember the primal creation mandate in Genesis 1. Be fruitful and multiply.
And remember the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15, where God promised to make Abraham's seed as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore.
So what we are witnessing in Exodus 1 verse 7 is the creation mandate and the covenant promise becoming concrete historical realities.
The words of God are kinetic. When he issues a decree, history bends to fulfill it.
The graves of the patriarchs could not bury the promise.
And the rising nationalism of the new Egyptian empire could not construct a dam high enough to stop the overflowing river of divine proliferation.
God spoke, and the biological reality of the Israelite people responded.
It is truly awe-inspiring.
So what does this all mean for the big picture of the Bible? Let's pull back the lens.
Okay.
We have this local population boom happening in ancient Egypt. But how does this connect to the New Testament? We always want to read the Old Testament with an eye toward the gospel. How does this connect to Jesus Christ?
Well, to understand the full weight of this passage, we have to trace its redemptive historical path.
And the Old Testament is not just a collection of moral fables. It is the architectural blueprint for the incarnation.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. If the hostile Egyptian empire had succeeded in wiping out or assimilating the physical seed of Israel in Goshen,
The human lineage of the incarnate Son of God would have been severed.
yes. Let's trace the line. Specifically, the tribe of Judah was among those listed in the opening verses.
And the prophets later declared that the Messiah had to come from the line of Judah.
Therefore, the preservation of these people in Egypt is not just an ancient origin story about a Middle Eastern nation. It is an indispensable link in the chain of salvation.
If there is no supernatural preservation in Goshen, there is no Bethlehem, there is no cross, and there is no resurrection.
God preserved the physical descendants in Egypt because he was actively bringing the Redeemer through their line.
The survival of the 70 was the survival of the promised seed.
Here is where it gets highly fascinating. The sources draw an intricate typological connection between what happens here in Egypt and what happens in the New Testament with Jesus.
For you listening, typology is a way of reading the Bible, where an Old Testament historical event, person, or institution acts as a foreshadowing or a pattern for a later reality.
Usually fulfilled in Christ.
Right. It is not just making up allegories. It is recognizing that God authors history in rhyming patterns.
The sources bring up Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, which says, "Out of Egypt I called my son."
Historically, in the context of Hosea, that verse refers to God calling the nation of Israel out of slavery in the Exodus.
But Matthew chapter 2, verse 15 applies that exact same verse directly to the infant Jesus.
How does the text justify taking a verse about a whole nation and applying it to one baby?
The parallel is established by divine design. In Exodus, we see a paranoid, hostile earthly king, the Pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, who issues an infanticide decree to try to destroy the seed of Israel.
He tries to kill the sons by having them thrown into the Nile River.
He sees a rival kingdom growing within his borders and attempts to crush it with state-sponsored violence.
Centuries later, in the Gospel of Matthew, we see another paranoid, hostile, earthly king.
King Herod.
Right. Herod hears that a king of the Jews has been born, and he issues an infanticide decree in Bethlehem to destroy the true Son of God.
He slaughters the infants in an attempt to protect his throne.
In both instances, the rulers of this world rage against God's redemptive purpose.
They use their political authority and military might to try and extinguish the light of the world.
And in both instances, God miraculously preserves his chosen deliverer.
Earthly kings trying to outmaneuver the sovereign God and failing spectacularly every time. It is a recurring theme.
God takes Israel down into Egypt to protect them from a famine in Canaan and then calls them out.
And God tells Joseph and Mary to take the baby Jesus down into Egypt to protect him from Herod and Canaan, and then calls him out.
It is a perfect historical rhyme. Just as God took his corporate national son down to Egypt for physical preservation and called him out,
He took his eternal incarnate son down to Egypt to preserve him from Herod, and then called him out to accomplish our redemption.
the sheer genius of that historical architecture is breathtaking. It proves that the same mind is writing the entire story.
It is the ultimate proof of a sovereign author, and it brings us directly to the doctrine of providence.
The sources explicitly tie this passage to chapter 5 of the Westminster Confession of Faith.
That chapter states that God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things.
It states that nothing is outside of his control, from the greatest to the least. We need to unpack those four verbs: uphold, direct, dispose, and govern.
God upholds reality by keeping it in existence.
He directs history by steering it toward his appointed end.
He disposes, meaning he places people and events exactly where they need to be, like Joseph in the prime minister's seat.
And he governs, ruling over the moral actions of men, even using the wicked intentions of a xenophobic Pharaoh to accomplish the multiplication of his own people.
The authors of our sources are very aggressive in applying this theology to the modern church.
Let's talk about that modern application.
They argue that understanding God's sovereign multiplication should cause us to totally reject all forms of pragmatism.
In the contemporary religious landscape, there are many seeker-sensitive or pragmatic church growth movements.
Movements that rely heavily on marketing strategies, psychological manipulation, or cultural accommodation to increase their numbers.
They operate like modern corporations trying to capture market share.
But Exodus 1 shows us that true multiplication is a sovereign gift from God.
It is achieved through ordinary, faithful obedience to his word, not through clever human tactics.
The church does not need to reinvent its message or compromise its theology to survive a hostile culture.
The God who multiplied the Hebrews in a hostile pagan environment is fully capable of expanding his kingdom today through the faithful, straightforward preaching of the gospel.
He does not need our marketing gimmicks. He needs our faithfulness.
That is a highly critical application.
Think about the original audience who heard this text first. Moses wrote the book of Exodus for the second generation of Israelites.
These were the people standing on the plains of Moab, getting ready to cross the Jordan River and face the Canaanites.
They were terrified. They knew the Canaanites had walled cities reaching to the sky, and they had advanced iron chariots.
From a military standpoint, the Israelites were severely outmatched.
But Moses gives them this history lesson to cure their fear. He is showing them their own origin story.
He is telling them, look backward before you look forward.
If God could take 70 vulnerable people and turn them into an empire-threatening nation right under Pharaoh's nose, inside the most powerful empire on earth, while they had absolutely no political rights and no standing army,
then the high walls of Jericho and the iron chariots of Canaan mean absolutely nothing.
Moses is using the history of God's providence to fuel their courage for the present battle.
That is the pastoral genius of the text. It is not just history. It is ammunition for faith.
And it brings us directly to you listening today.
When you look at shifting demographics, widespread cultural decay, or hostile political climates, the believer is commanded to reject cultural cowardice.
We are not to look at the news cycle and panic.
We are not to look at the rising hostility toward Christian values and assume that the church is going to be wiped out.
The political rulers of our day, whoever they might be, whatever policies they might enact, are simply pawns executing God's preordained purposes.
True faith looks past the visible threats, past the shouting politicians, past the hostile corporate structures, and rests securely in the invisible, sovereign hand of God.
If he preserves his people in Goshen against the might of the 18th dynasty, he will preserve his people now.
The summary is quite clear. God's decrees do not depend on human strength.
His promises survive the death of his most gifted servants. We are called to rest in that sovereignty, to reject fear, and to continue in ordinary faithful obedience.
Knowing that the same God governs history today.
The same God who used the Egyptian frog goddess as a punchline for his own sovereignty is the God who is directing the events of your life right now.
Okay, let's summarize the massive theological weight we just unpacked from these 7 short verses.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started with what looked like a boring list of names and a cold death notice. Joseph died, the patriarchs died, all that generation died.
The human shields were removed, and the Israelites were left utterly exposed in a hostile military buffer zone.
But the grave cannot bury the promises of the living God. When human mediation failed, God stepped in with direct, supernatural energy.
Causing 5 verbs of multiplication to explode into history.
He kept his covenant. He preserved the physical lineage of the Messiah so that Jesus could be born in Bethlehem. And he humiliated the gods and kings of Egypt in the process.
The grammar of grace proves that God's plan is continuous, unstoppable, and deeply personal.
It is a phenomenal text. It strips away all our human boasting and forces us to look entirely to the Creator for our survival and our growth.
It really does.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. The world measures success by loud, visible strength.
We look for immediate results, massive crowds, viral moments, and political dominance.
We want the power of the Egyptian empire. But look at how God worked in Goshen.
He worked in the quiet spaces.
He worked in the maternity wards. He worked in the daily, unseen lives of ordinary families who were simply being fruitful and multiplying.
What if the unseen, quiet faithfulness in your own household right now?
The daily routines, the simple prayers over dinner, the mundane tasks of raising a family in the fear of the Lord, and staying faithful to your local congregation.
What if that quietness is the very instrument God is using to outlast the loud, intimidating empires of our current moment?
What if your ordinary faithfulness is the seed of a future demographic explosion that the hostile culture cannot stop? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Word. We will see you next time.